Hey, I'm Sage Plays. Welcome back to Bellemont Zoo, where today we're going to be building a habitat for one of the latest animals in the game, the African leopard. It's been a while since the last episode. Thank you so much for joining me again. Let's head over to the Africa section and start building. We're going to be building in between the cheetah and black rhino habitat that we built in the last episode and the meerkats. And we're going to be doing something in this build that we've never been able to successfully do before, which I'm excited about, which is build a habitat where one of the viewing windows uses the guitar string style of viewing. It's something we attempted once in San Bernardino Zoo at the Arctic fox habitat with what was the thinnest piece in the game at the time, the grasslands pole. But now, since the Zookeeper's Animal Pack, we have the string, which is even thinner, and we're going to be able to do a much better job of replicating that style of habitat barrier here, and we will get onto that later. To begin with, we're going to get our paths and our terrain sorted out. That box there is give or take about 800 meters, which is roughly what we need for one African leopard, which is what we're going to be having. And we're going to join the terrain on down to the path that goes into the Africa area. The path on the right of the screen where the guests are walking at the moment will be removed. We're not going to need that. That'll be reconfigured to move around the habitat. So we'll just lift this terrain up, bury a few of those guests there. They'll be fine, don't worry. And then we'll start getting some walls in. The habitat's going to be based on Leopard Valley at Zoo Leipzig, which is a really nice looking habitat, really well themed, and we're going to be using a lot of their theming ideas in this build. Now we're going with the African leopard here. Normally in Europe you see the Amur leopards in zoos, even if it's in an African area. And the reason for that is that the subspecies of leopard, the Amur leopard, is really endangered. There's only 1,000 or so, I think, left in the wild, whereas the African leopard is one of the few big cats that isn't particularly endangered at the moment. And there are numerous worldwide breeding programs for the Amur leopard to try and save it from extinction. So zoos tend to have those rather than the African leopards. But seeing as the African leopard is one of the newest animals in Planet Zoo, and we were in an African section, I decided that we'd have the African leopard rather than the Amur leopard here. They are held in a few zoos in Europe, and I figure that this habitat will just hold one leopard. It would be like an overflow habitat. Zoos often do that where they don't intend to breed a species. So when other zoos are breeding a species, or in this case a subspecies of animal, obviously once they have the babies need to go somewhere rather than just stay in the same habitat with their parents. So they will normally try and be placed with other breeding zoos. Sometimes other zoos in the breeding program don't have space, or there'll be a particular genetic line that's overrepresented at the moment and they don't want to breed it anymore. And that is where zoos come in, who will just have one of the animals so that it's got a home and give it a nice habitat to live in, and it might be moved to a breeding facility in future, might spend its whole life in the zoo. It depends on what needs to happen with that particular species. That's what we're going to do here. What you're looking at is the first viewing gallery in the habitat, and this is the part that's most heavily based on Zoo Leipzig. So the way it works is we've got a fence here which keeps the guests back, and then there's an area of soil, and then behind that is the guitar string barrier that we're going to build in a minute. So we'll put some rocks in here to separate off that viewing window, and then we're going to have a glass viewing window on this side as well. So there's two different types of viewing for the guests, and then we'll start building the guitar string. If you're not sure what a guitar string barrier is, then you're about to find out. It's basically sort of like mesh, except it only goes vertically. There's no horizontal parts, and it is really, really thin, but really strong. So it gives a much better view for the guests, because without the horizontal parts of the barrier, you can sort of look between the wires, which are, like I say, really thin, and that gives you a really good view. And this new string piece from the Zookeeper's Animal Pack enables us finally to do a really good job of making a guitar string barrier. So I placed one piece of string down, recolored it. We're just going to use this egg piece to give us some spacing so we can make sure each piece of wire is exactly the same distance from the others. So I've grouped it together. We'll put one in there, and then we can start copying them along this piece of wood here until it's all filled up. I love how this string looks now that it's thinner. I was semi-happy with our attempt at this in San Bernardino Zoo, but it did look a little bit prison-y when you looked at the habitat, because the wires look more like bars. And then we can just go in and delete the eggs, and we have ourselves a guitar string barrier. We'll get this one section of it into place, and then we'll copy it and get it all the way across this area here. So we're going to move it back so it's quite some way behind the fence. That prevents people from being able to stick their fingers through the bars, or the leopard from doing the same from the other side. Both the viewing galleries are going to be sort of semi-indoors. We're going to have a roof over it, and then loads of big logs and rocks and things like that to theme it all. Always good to do that so you get the lighting darker for the guests where they're standing and brighter in the habitat. Thanks for your patience waiting for this episode, by the way. I know it's been a month since the last episode. I think it's the longest time without a Planet Zoo episode on this channel since day one. But my 2-week holiday in Cambodia was amazing. I'm full of inspiration for future builds, so watch out for some of those next year. Back to this build, we're going to copy this piece of rock over here to start tidying up the left-hand viewing gallery, and then we'll put the glass in for the right-hand viewing gallery. We're going to do all the barriers now. This one here will be glass. All the ones that run underneath the rocks will be wood to stop people from trying to see through the rocks, and then the barriers across this part here will be null barriers, so they're invisible. So we'll just do them out of glass first of all. I always find it easier just to use one barrier when I build it all, and then once we've got them all in, we'll go back in and change them to their respective barrier types depending on where they are. We'll also replace the glass with a nice curved one a bit later on, and then we're just going to fill in this gap with some more rocks. This mossy rock, or the dynamic mossy rock I think it is, which is like the almost like a tropical rock with a bit of moss on it as well, goes really nicely with the faux rocks that we've got in here. It's a really nice contrast, and once we've got enough of these in here to get a realistic looking rock pile, it's only a tiny little detail, you'll barely notice it once everything else is put in there. I am really happy with that pile of rocks. Nice. Okay, let's move on and create the big logs that are going to be a big part of the theming in this area where the guests are. So we're going to take one of the big Planet Zoo logs, and then some of the faux tree trunks as well, and then get loads of the strangler fig roots to start making an interesting looking log which we can use a few times, suspended over the paths so that the guests walk underneath them as they go into and out of the viewing area. The cheetah and rhino habitat that we built last time is pretty much on the main path through this area, so it's important that the leopard habitat has its own little paths going off the main path for viewing so that we don't get congestion, and also just helps separate things, give them their own identity. So we're going to take some dead trees as well and put those inside this log so we can get some branches coming out, and just generally throw as much stuff as we can to get it to look really interesting, and then we can start placing them into the area leading up to the habitat. So we got 2 of them here. I think we're going to have 3 altogether, and we'll put a load of foliage and stuff on them as well, grow some plants on them, just get a really nice lush look as people come into the habitat. We'll put some actual sort of planted trees in as well, and then we'll move on to building the structure that the guests are going to be inside when they're viewing the leopard. Apologies for the state of my voice in this video. Again, I picked up a cold in Cambodia. I just cannot seem to shake it. Is making it difficult to record these voiceovers, so hope it doesn't sound too bad when you're listening to it. This shelter is going to be really simple because it's going to be mainly covered up with rocks, foliage, those big logs we just built, etc. So it's going to have quite an organic feel when you're in there. So I want it to be made entirely or almost entirely out of logs. And we'll get some simple slate roofs on as well, and just build a really simple building in one little section like this, and then we can use this section to create the full shelter that the guests will go into. I love how the city looks in the backdrop. You can see it here. I get a lot of comments about the city backdrop in this zoo. So just to reiterate what I said at the start, almost all of those buildings are just from the workshop. I didn't build them, I just placed them in a nice arrangement. Only the buildings are right in front of the zoo entrance, which are based on the staff buildings at Zoo Leipzig, were built by me. Everything else is workshop. So if you want your own city zoo backdrop to build in, it is so simple to make it yourself. I think I spent a couple of evenings doing the entirety of this map. It is so easy to make, you can just do it yourself. Now we're going to start covering this in foliage. We're going to use one of my favourite plants in the game, the hosta. This is so good for doing creeping plants that go up walls, even though it's not really designed for that. If you just sink it in a little bit, you can start doing it like this, and it avoids having to use the ivy like we're using here for everything. We've got some variegated ivy as well, and seeing as we're in Europe, we can mix some of that in as well to start to get a really organic look to this building. You'll barely even notice the actual build itself by the time it's finished. It'll all be covered up with foliage. Got some of these vines on here as well. It just gives us a really overgrown, natural looking kind of area for the guests to come into. We'll do the same thing on this big log here with the hosta, and then more of these liana vines, and start getting it away from just being one piece. You can see it looks a lot more interesting now. Going to drop a few of these dead trees around as well, and just shift Lion's amazing info sign a little bit so everything sits together nicely. That is starting to look really good. Let's get on to the habitat itself. Big cats, especially leopards, who are probably the best climbers out of all of them, need mesh over the top of the habitat to make sure they can't get out. And as far as I'm concerned, you've got two choices when you're building mesh. You can use Haribo's mesh from the workshop, or you can use Goron's mesh from the workshop. Building it yourself, not so much fun. It takes so long, weeks of work just to get one piece of mesh done. We don't have that kind of time. So for this build, we're going to use Haribo's mesh, which we've not used for a while. We've certainly not used that in this zoo. I'm not sure if we even used it in San Bernardino Zoo. It might be Tecton Zoo the last time we used this, but it's such a nice piece. And because it's modular, you can just put two of them in and start rotating them to get them to the shape that you want. And then you can just go in and start deleting poles here, adding poles there, moving the mesh around and getting it to exactly fit your habitat. So that's the basic shape that we're going to have. It won't be particularly noticeable. Most of it will be covered up by the building in front of it. And then we'll just go in and start putting some sides in so that it comes down and joins onto the rocks below the habitat. We don't want anything spoiling the walk into the area itself. And when it's finished, this habitat sits really nicely into the African area. You can just see it sort of peeking out above a few other habitats, but it's not really particularly noticeable until you actually get into the habitat itself, which is exactly what we want for this area. And this African area is really starting to come together now. We've got meerkats, spurred tortoises, hamadryas baboons, cheetah, black rhino, and very soon African leopards as well. We've just got the huge savanna to go, and that is Africa completed. Alright, let's move on to the inside of the habitat now. We're going to start by covering up some of the support poles with some trees. The main thing I want in the interior of the habitat is cover for the leopard. So leopards are really shy. They will not be happy in a habitat where they are in full view of the guests all day long or anything like that. We need to make sure there is loads of foliage in here, loads of little spots that they can hide behind. This will not be a habitat where you are guaranteed a view of the animal, that is for sure. And that's pretty standard for any good leopard habitat. The nearest leopard to me is the Amur leopards at Yorkshire Wildlife Park, and I'm pretty sure it was maybe my 4th or 5th visit before I ever saw a leopard. But that's fine, that is what leopards want, and the animal welfare is the most important thing. So we're going to replicate that here, get a really busy habitat together. We're going to use some of the stacked rocks that we used in the baboon habitat to put a little centerpiece in, and then have the back half of the habitat higher than the front half of the habitat to try and improve the chances of the guests getting at least a glimpse of it. We're going to have some logs and various other bits of climbing as well to get the leopard from the lower part to the higher part, so they've got loads of different ways to get between the two. So we'll rotate one more of these bits of rocks and get that in there, and then we can start doing some more planting. So we're going to get loads of elephant grass and reeds and use that to cover up the remaining support poles. And then we'll get dring grass and buffalo grass in as well and start making the floor look a lot more interesting. You can ignore that awful looking terrain there. We'll sort that out before the build is done. And then, like we did in the last episode, we'll group everything together and just drop it down a little bit. And then we'll get some rocks in. And this is starting to look really lush now. We'll make sure the rocks don't clip through the plants as always. And then it's on to the climbing. So we'll get one of the climbable logs, and we're going to have that suspended between this big rock in the foreground and then the stacked rocks in the background, so the leopard can climb over that if they want to get up there, or obviously they can just walk straight up the rocks, whichever they'd rather do. And then we're going to put our generic backstage building that we designed in the last episode in, just to make things look more realistic. No need for the animals to actually be able to get into it in sandbox mode, but it just makes the whole zoo look better when we've got things like that in it. And we'll put an animal door in here as well, so we can see how they would get from the shelter into the habitat. And that's also where we're going to be putting the keeper door, which we will do in a second. I'm just making sure it's not too visible from either of the viewing galleries. I'm going to recolor that so it sits in nicely with the rocks. Use 2 of them so we can get a more sensibly sized door. And then we'll finish off the climbing. So this is one of the standard wooden climbing blueprints from the game. Very rare that we use a Frontier blueprint in any of our zoos, but the all-wood climbing frames are pretty much exactly what I would build myself. So these are one of the few blueprints that we ever use. We'll just make a few adjustments to it so it fits perfectly into this habitat. I'm really happy with that. I'm going to switch out that tree for something a bit more interesting looking. And then finally, we'll connect the staff gate to one of the main paths, and that is the habitat finished. Just going to do some more planting around the edges of the habitat to sit it in nicely with the rest of the Africa area. This little forest blueprint that we made has been so useful. It's been going all over the zoo. Really worthwhile just making one little patch of forest that suits your zoo in particular, and then you can just use that everywhere. We'll throw a few more bushes in on top of these rocks, and that is everything done. Let's check it out. Here's the entrance to the habitat. You can see the leopard just jumping into the background there. And here he is through the glass viewing, inspecting his little fire hose ball. Love the African leopard model, it's really good and quite distinct from the Amur leopard model, which makes it even more useful. There's the log that you put in so he can get between each side of his habitat. I'm watching him here spending an awful lot of time climbing, pretty much all his time climbing. I think he climbs more than the monkeys do in this game, which is kind of annoying. But good to have some realistic animal behaviours in the game, and just look how gorgeous the model is. They're absolutely amazing. You can see how good the view is through the guitar string that we put in. I'm really happy with that. It's just so much closer to real life than what we achieved back in San Bernardino Zoo. Let's check out where we started today. And this is where we are now. One of the smaller additions to the zoo so far, but I'm really happy with it. We'll check out the Explorers Club fountain. Thank you so much to all of you who have joined. Hit the join button on the channel if you want to see your name up here. Thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you again soon for some more Planet Zoo.